Hello, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome to the fourth session of Nick Land's Bitcoin and Philosophy seminar. Nick, do you want to take over?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Week 4 is a kind of transition, isn't it? Because we're crossing from what is in theory a block to another block next week, and I think the loose definition of what divides those blocks is the first 4 are really about working through the Satoshi Nakamoto paper, so we can assume that's there in the second 4, which will be more topic oriented. So I'm going to pretend with as much conviction as I can that we've dutifully worked our way through the whole of the 2008 paper by the end of today. And to help me along with that, I think section 10 of that paper, which is really can be treated, I think, as the final substantial section of the paper, ties up very well with a topic that I think has converged on the classroom this week. I've got three contributions from Ryan, Laura, and Jake, and all of them are circling very much, I think, the same issue, which I think, at least to start off with, is a good thing to hold on to, and there's a lot of mileage in it. So I would be surprised if it was to peter out or to get supplanted. And that's really questions to do with identity. The name of section 10 of the paper, or the label for it, is privacy, which is obviously an incredibly laden term and goes off in itself in all kinds of directions. But it's only, I think, one aspect of this topic, and sort of trying to muster a sense of the kind of threads that converge upon it it's impressive to me how many different issues all connect up with it. So I thought I'd start off. I'll try and keep this intro relatively short, and as always, please don't be inhibited about jumping in at any point. But I thought I'd start off with just a bit of philosophical framing for it to try to legitimate the basic idea of this being a Bitcoin and philosophy course, and then pulling at some of these threads that are feeding into this notion of identity in the way that we're coming across it here. So again, totally standard in terms of what I'm up to here. I will start off with Kant on this, and the guiding element that he introduces to this. If you're coming to it out of the theoretical side of his philosophy, which I think everyone treats naturally as a starting point and as a question of theory and the understanding, the key element is the notion of the empirical ego. And the empirical ego ties together a lot of the things we're going to be talking about. And I think the way to introduce it, first of all, just again starting from the theoretical side of Kant's work, is that just as when you're dealing with an object, and of course in the most sort of the types of modern thinking, very recent contemporary thinking that have got people very excited, this sort of object-oriented approach, it very strongly takes the theoretical objective side of the transcendental project and concentrates on the distinction between the phenomenal and noumenal object. And I'm sure that sort of the ways that's developed and the various directions that's taken people are kind of familiar to people. I think the key thing to hold on to from it is that the phenomenal object is structured transcendentally, or as we would say if we're translating all this language into a more electronic media context, it's formatted. So there's a system, there's a transcendental element for Kant, that's the transcendental subject. In these electronic media, it's dependent upon the particular protocol and system we're dealing with. But there's a system that is the continuous, constant element, whatever particular ingredients one's dealing with, that stamps a format onto all the elements that are in play in that system. Those elements then being the factual, empirical elements that you're concerned with. But all of them have a structure. They're all within a particular theatre with a particular structure, and they can play out all kinds of different dramas within that theatre. But the structure of the theatre is what you see if you take this transcendental retreat or step back and you look, well, what is actually the continuous structure of this performance? Whatever we're seeing, whatever the drama and light and distractions of the actual happenings, what is the constant system of representation that we're seeing there? And so once you make that step, you have this distinction automatically between the phenomenal side of the object, that part of it that is structured in this way, that is on stage for us, and that part of the object that, to use a modern, or when I say modern, I should say extremely recent mode of talking about this, is withdrawn or withheld, or in some way is beyond our phenomenal apprehension. So that's basically, obviously, the whole problematic of the first critique, the things that follow from that. But the important thing, I think, for us, if we're now going to be talking on this question of identity and its specifically subjective aspect, is that you can reflect this back. You can first of all reflect it back a little bit, still at the level of the understanding and of theory, into psychology, where you get a distinction between an empirical and a transcendental subject. And the empirical subject is simply the subject as it appears on the stage of one's transcendental perception of the world. So one has one stars in one's own play, or at least appears in one's own play. There might be people who are commendably able to keep themselves totally in proportion, but let's just say that that typically one takes a prominent role in one's own drama of existence, among a whole bunch of other identities that have relevant parts or cameos or walk-on parts or such like. But obviously, as soon as you look at it like this, you know transcendentally that one's empirical ego is an appearance. It's not the real self necessarily, any more than the noumenon, the withdrawn thing in itself is the real thing. So the empirical ego is not the real self, it's the self as it appears psychologically. It's just, you could say, simply the psychological self. But if you reflect back further and in fact totally reverse the whole angle of orientation into Kant's practical philosophy, into the question of action and agency, one has this same splitting, the same rift, or as we would call it in Heideggerian vocabulary, the same ontological difference between the empirical and the transcendental. And then Kant starts using the vocabulary very consistently of heteronomy and autonomy. And that perfectly aligns with what we've just been talking about. The heteronomy is the empirical side of the person. It's the person as conditioned by anything we could want to name as being empirical forces in the world. Social forces, heredity, influences of friends, social environment, you name it. Anything that is actually part of any factual scientific account of the person, for Kant, and it belongs in this category of heteronomy. Whereas autonomy is the part of the self that is just like the withdrawn side of the object, is the withdrawn side of the subject. It's the part of the subject that is actually running the system of appearances, but is not itself apparent. and it's not apparent even on a certain level of practical activity, insofar as that practical activity is governed by understandable impulses and motives and incentives drawn from the empirical world. Now, I'm not going to go much further with this on the philosophical level, because it's the most fascinating, deepest, endless abyss, I think, in modern philosophy. You know, all the problems on the objective side are absolutely overwhelmed by the problems that come in on the subjective side. And within decades of Kant's work, already vastly radical transformations of this structure had been brought into play by people saying, well, what is assumed by the Kantian model of the subject that is not actually in any way guaranteed by the principles of transcendental philosophy itself? I.e., people were saying Kant is simply projecting back a lot of structures to do with the individual, private, volitional person that he has inherited from his sort of sense of the empirical self, and just projected them where they totally don't belong into this transcendental realm. And so what the true nature of the transcendental subject becomes this massively problematic, engaging question. You know, you can go in all directions, from sort of Heideggerian Dasein to the machinic unconscious. All of these kind of formations are attempts to say what is really the puppet master behind the puppetry of the empirical self, or the self subjected to heteronymous impulses. But yes, before, I'll just say I'll just read a line of Kant, which I think is very helpful to this. He says in the groundwork to the metaphysics of morals, a person is a subject whose actions can be imputed to him, subject to no other laws than those he gives to himself, either alone or at least along with others. So this is a sort of declaration of the principle of autonomy as something that is actually a defining characteristic of the transcendental subject, which is also the moral or practical subject. But if in philosophy we kind of absolutely have to start exploring abysses if we're going to go into this area, in the era of electronic media, I think this very strange and interesting thing happens that provides a much, much more convenient and seductive avenue to these questions, which is, rather than stepping back from our naive empirical subject to its conditions to try to get behind the apparent self, to what lies behind the apparent self, instead we start to see the appearance of virtual selves, avatars of all kinds in games, where people obviously have a fictional character that is related to them as they are, at least by some kind of analogy, to the deep or transcendental subject. And so rather than the initial move being this backward step, to step back out of the self, it's instead people step without being asked, they are propelled or stumble into this world of this proliferation of virtual identities, avatars, internet personalities, which, when seen with some subsequent reflection, begin to sort of narrativize this relation back behind the self. I think that there's a bunch of topics that I should really try and run through quickly on this, because it's such an incredibly traffic dense zone. The thing that's stimulated a lot that stimulated a lot of this on the classroom was talking about the question of online personalities as targets for consumer marketing. So Laura provided a set of links about this to do with the way that your profile becomes this extremely valuable marketing asset to be targeted by companies that are in a position now at a certain point of, obviously we're on the Moore's curve, and at a certain point integrating all the information required to make that online personality a productive target for marketing activities is crossed, and you then get this huge wave activity that I think is quite recent. It's really only sort of fully taken off in the last couple of years. So there's that whole side of it, and these questions about privacy that rise very strongly in that. And the fact that, as I say, people have stumbled into these identities. When people set up their Facebook accounts and set up their various avatars for their social media activities, they're not deliberately playing some experiment with identity. They're simply doing something that in the social milieu that we exist in now seems eminently sensible and straightforward and initially unproblematic, and only subsequently do people begin to think, hang on, what is this puppet that ties together so many of my characteristics and tells people so much about me and allows people to extract value in certain ways from the kind of consistencies of behavior and particularly from the point of view we've just been talking, commercial behavior that this avatar has been engaged in. So there's that whole commercial side, and there's obviously also a massively important police and security side to this question. You know, I absolutely adore this this term that is used by various security services where they talk about a person of interest, which again is actually a virtual persona. It might be sort of referring to something beyond that, but it's really a bundle, it's a nexus of various kinds of communicative and political activities that can all be bundled together into some coherent virtual personality, who then can be subjected to some kind of systematic surveillance and put on all kinds of relevant databases and all of these kind of things. So it's a very closely related issue at a sufficiently abstract conceptual level, but obviously a very different issue concretely about whether people are concerned about the profile that is taking place for them on the NSA database, or whether they're concerned with the way that Google is bundling and commercializing their internet presence or something. But the point that I'd really want to sort of repeat, because I think it's the crucial thing, is that these virtual personalities are strictly analogous to empirical egos. That's to say, they're formatted by a particular media system and act as the puppet of something that in that case we feel comfortable that we understand. We think, oh, that's our avatar, that's our particular virtual personality for this particular system. But the relation is extremely similar in principle, and actually has the potential to open up a question about what in real life identities are, using the actual leveraging tools that transcendental philosophy has provided us with. Finally, I think in this initial thing is just to then obviously tie it into Bitcoin, in particular with this the section 10 of the Bitcoin paper, which contains the discussion is interesting, but I think I find it a little bit elusive, actually a little bit evasive, I should say. That it's most clearly, what he's talking about is most clearly shown by a little diagram that is contained in the middle of this section, where he's contrasting the Bitcoin model with what he calls the traditional privacy model. And the distinction is extremely straightforward in the sense that there's a simple thing that happens that he thinks totally transforms the structure of this. And he does it as two flowcharts, where on the traditional privacy model, there's identities that then goes to transactions, which is then shared with some trusted third party who acts to credentialize your identity to ensure it or guarantee it, and then passes through to the counterparty of the transaction, who then is confident they know who you are and that someone in authority knows who you are so they can trust you. And that the break then happens with the public, in that the whole series of exchanges is kept private in this sense. It's not a totally individuated personal privacy because it's been shared with particular people, but you have a relation. For instance, you engage in a conventional bank transaction, you want to pass money to some particular person, you know about it, the person receiving the money knows about it, the bank knows about it, and of course government and tax authorities know about it, but the public does not know about it. That's where the break happens. It's not on a public ledger. It's not a public transaction. So the break takes place where you have privacy on one side, the public on the other side, and that's the way everyone has been used to engaging in these kind of processes. The new model has transactions passing directly across the public domain on this public ledger. Everyone knows what transactions are taking place. There's no secrecy there at all. The wall that was previously built to maintain privacy is gone now, just simply obliterated. And you have this public sphere in the form of the blockchain where everyone can see exactly what is happening. So in order for privacy to be maintained, that previous boundary has to be shifted. And it's shifted to a distinction between identity and transactions. So the distinction is now drawn actually in a way that we should be ready for from this question of transcendental philosophy. It's drawn within the subject, between the transcendental and empirical aspects of the self. That's to say, the noumenal self, the in real life self, the identity that you have outside the system, unformatted, not at all subjected to these structures of representation, is now beyond the boundary of publicity. And the avatar, the wallet, the account, the Bitcoin agent is completely exposed. And so it's between these two sides of identity that any possibility of privacy now has to exist within. So this boundary now that takes place between you and your account, between you and your puppet within the Bitcoin system, has now become absolutely critical. It's a kind of gulf of absolute importance to understanding how this question of identity is going to proceed. And obviously it's for that reason hugely invested in all kinds of ways. You know, there's everyone's privacy concerns about Bitcoin, people being tracked down, of the things coming up around the Silk Road and these various sting operations and everything on that level is obviously totally about this difference. Because if anyone else can actually synthesize those two sides of the self now, then there's no privacy at all. Everything is completely exposed. Similarly, when all the questions about scams and frauds and all of the Mt. Gox issue and all of this whole side about security in Bitcoin is also totally tied up around this gulf, because you have people who are handling your online identity, and they are what people talk about the on and off ramps into Bitcoin. And that's an extremely interesting language, because it's easy to simply, the system itself is so neat that you can just simply spend your time completely intellectually inside the Bitcoin system. But of course, it only works as a commercial system because it's synthesized with a larger socioeconomic system, and that synthesis has to involve off-ramps and on-ramps. You have to be able to convert stuff into Bitcoins and out of Bitcoins, and that has, up to this stage, involved these exchanges. And because those exchanges are precisely in this problematic boundary zone, they're at the edge of the system where it mediating between this completely anonymous, or we should be more cautious, let's say pseudonymous Bitcoin identity and your real social identity, the person who has a bank account full of dollar bills and wants to convert them into Bitcoin. It's this zone of particular enormous vulnerability in the system. So all of the sort of very standard discussions about how safe is Bitcoin, do people trust Bitcoin as a whole, are also focused on this particular gulf and how it works and how secure it is and the kind of things that happen when it's being negotiated or mediated by various institutions or agents. Oh yeah, there's one more thing I'd just like to say about this, which is another, actually this is also fast, which is Ryan's incredibly fascinating link that he provided, which itself then explodes into 11 more links about decentralized applications. And this is this whole question about DAOs or DACs, digital autonomous entities of various kinds, which connects up with a much more traditional and slow-moving issue that's also been highly controversial about corporate personality. Because one of the things that happens when you draw this boundary between the transactional self within the system and the real self outside the system, and I think real is extremely useful word to not let slip by too fast, because it is very amphibious in the sense. As we've seen, real in the strong transcendental self means something incredibly opaque and obscure that requires monstrous efforts of sort of philosophical exploration to get any kind of access in. But it also, in this sense, means something that is misleadingly trivial. Like everyone knows who they really are. It's only when you go onto these systems or play a certain game that there becomes some question about your identity. And I think that those two aspects of the real seem as if they're simply different things that are kind of by some historical accident being designated by the same word. But I think they're not different things. I think that the way this is all working out is showing that they have a really deep conceptual relation to them, because in both cases the real is that thing that is outside the system of formatting that is in question in the particular case. And so once you draw the line here, as we've said before, the real self, the real person outside the system could be anything. Again, it's a kind of echo, a weird echo of this transcendental problematic. The virtual identity is formatted. It has to have certain personality characteristics and personality. It has to be able to engage in contracts. It has to behave as a kind of at least quasi-rational game-playing person. It has to be able to kind of sign, make agreements, stick to them, have some continuous commitment to those agreements across time. All kind of features that are again very conventional ones traditionally. But once you cross the line back out of that, you lose all sense of that. You no longer know. You're passing out of the formatting system. You don't know at all what applies any longer to what this real identity is. The virtual identity we know about by definition. We know about transcendentally in this case being the rules of the system. But the real identity, no, it's outside. We don't know what it is. And part of that is to do with individuality and collectivity, which is obviously at stake in this notion of corporate identity. It goes beyond the question of individuality and collectivity, because it is also on another axis to do with what is natural and human and various kinds of intelligent agents that might be completely synthetic. We don't know about that. But the point is, because this real identity can be anything, all that matters is that when represented within the system, it can maintain a consistent identity. And so a corporation, the Coca-Cola company, can have a Bitcoin wallet and behave as a person just the same as some particular individual can behave. You know, what previously was a contested, complex legal and political question about whether corporations are personal individuals, now is something that's absolutely just baked into the cake of the system. That, you know, anything that can run a Bitcoin account can run a Bitcoin account. And it's no longer possible to even think of setting criteria for that are not immanent to or intrinsic to the actual system itself, to the formatting system of that account. And so I won't spin this out any much longer, but just to say, obviously this question of digital autonomous organizations and digital autonomous companies slots perfectly into this. You know, if you can have some kind of software system that is competent to run a Bitcoin account, then it is a person within the terms of that system. There's no superior tribunal with access to the real that can say, oh no, that thing doesn't count because I can tell that that account is not the same as this other account, which belongs to some particular conventionally human person. All you know is that you have an account with a number on it, it's behaving in a certain way, it's engaging in a set of transactions. Bitcoin pretty much ensures that those transactions are going to be okay, in the sense it can't cheat you in any standard way. And so by moving this line, this break or split into the self, into the distinction between the two sides, the transcendental and empirical side of identity, automatically any effective cryptocurrency system is going to open this zone that this area most associated with Ethereum, but it's part of a much wider possibility of these completely synthetic agencies is now introduced. So I think I should pause because I've been rabbiting on and see what people want to do with any of this kind of stuff.
I'm not sure where exactly this leads into a question or a topic exactly, but so you mostly focused on issues of a one-to-one correspondence between the sort of account holder who does all of these transactions and the real self, whatever the real self happens to be outside of it. But I mean, Nakamoto says, and this is pretty straightforward, as an additional firewall, a new key pair, which we can pretty much sub for identity here in this context, should be used for each transaction to keep them from being So in fact, we're trying to, I mean, you know, for maximum security in the sense of anonymity or privacy, we're trying to split into, you know, a different avatar for every transaction. So it kind of works in the opposite direction from the loop that Kant is trying to impose, where you're consolidating the empirical self's behavior into an ever more singular and autonomous agent that, you know, corresponds with the noumenon's autonomy, just to some extent how I read Kant, I guess. And then at the same time, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, you go, yeah, sorry.
Oh yeah, just the other component of that sort of issue of the real that I was going to point out here was that the one time when you really have to break Nakamoto's suggestion here is with these exchanges that exchange for things outside the Bitcoin system, because if you want to exchange a bunch of Bitcoins for dollars or a bunch of dollars for Bitcoins, then since you've got this sort of Bitcoin cent by Bitcoin cent sort of multi-input transaction system is what mediates that. That links a lot of your Bitcoin assets together, and at least that one time establishes you as an entity that is linked to all of those coins. And so it's just interesting to me that singularity of the pseudonym would be forced in transactions outside the system, and at the same time that fragmenting that pseudo would be the means of ensuring the security of the real self.
Right. Yeah. I think the first part of that, I think it falls naturally into two parts, and the first part, I think, is possible to address much more confidently than the second. Not that it ends up somewhere easy, but it ends up somewhere, or it goes through somewhere very familiar, in the sense that these issues about the individuality, fragmentation, unity of the self are the traditional ways that this Kantian problem has been developed. And the person that I think is like really helpful here, because he's so straightforward and clean in the way he thinks about this, is Schopenhauer, who wrote the best short book on Kant I think that's ever been written. And his fundamental objection to Kant is to say, look, the very notion of individuality is part of the formatting. So when you tell me, to use your terms, that you've got a one-to-one correspondence between an empirical ego and a transcendental moral self standing outside of the theater, but still an individual of some kind, a real individual, he says you've got no basis for that at all. The very notion of individuality is part of the theatrical performance. And for him, he then goes into this undifferentiated cosmic will that is the outside of the empirical self. Now, obviously, this, in a fascinating way, this little drama is totally then rehearsed by what you've just said, where you have all of these different Bitcoin accounts to try and maintain your security, but there's this one integral real being on the outside of the system, so that someone watching the public ledger and seeing all these myriad of little accounts doing their things is seeing a bunch of what look to be differentiated individual accounts, but actually when you take the step back into the real, you see that actually there's this integrative process there, and there's one real being that just has this multiplicity of avatars. And it's obviously the same thing that happens in all kinds of formats. I mean, I know some nutters who seriously have like 12 Twitter accounts, and play all kinds of games about which of these are the same person and which aren't, and all of this kind of thing. Or if you're someone who's really into online games or something like that, and you're playing a whole bunch of different characters, maybe in the same or different games, there's a natural tendency as you cross this line from the real into the apparent side of the self to undergo fragmentation. And while it is possible for the reverse to occur, it's more difficult and requires much more complicated procedures to do that. So, I mean, on the second side of what you're saying, I think it's a more difficult thing to say something quick about, for sure. I might just I might just hold fire on that and see whether
okay.
I was thinking, really trying to get a grip on the transcendental empirical distinction with regard to Bitcoin. and the way you're making a distinction. And I'm thinking as you're speaking, Nick, are you? I get the impression that you're not trying to collapse the distinction in these completely synthetic agencies as you describe them, but you think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there remains a distinction. The question is how the distinction works itself out with regard to digitality and in particular cryptocurrencies. And I understand you to be saying that the Bitcoin self, so to speak, the self that's in the public ledger, is the empirical ego, but then the more complicated assessment is what then is the transcendental self. And in this case, I take you to be saying that it's outside of that. It's when you step back and you're in the real. But is that you and I then, and everybody else?
I think that this is, I'd really like to hold that open as a problem, because it's, to me, what's fascinating about this is that in the philosophical tradition, it is an absolute extraordinary problem, obviously. I mean, this thing about how can you even think at all about what a transcendental self would be has been something that the greatest geniuses in history have just burst their blood vessels on, and gone to these extraordinary, just mad excesses of thought, really, in trying to do that. And yet, as you say, in this example, it seems completely unproblematic. You seem that you're just returning home. When you return to the real, you're just coming back to common sense, coming back to something that's already understood. And if anything, the difficult side of the rift is on the empirical side now, where these weird things happen with the avatars, and it's new, and we don't quite know how it's all working out, and so there seems to be this kind of reversal of difficulty happening there. But I think that bringing in one more, just to kind of in a way stir the broth even more by bringing what seems to me one more extremely pertinent example of the way this works, is the simulation argument. I don't know whether everyone's familiar with this. It's really worth looking. I'll put up a link for the most well-known version of it. It comes from Hans Moravec in the 1980s, but the most famous version is the one done by Nick Bostrom, and it's obviously publicized or promoted as this basic question: are we living in a computer simulation? And it actually, I think, is structurally absolutely indistinguishable from the issues we're dealing with, because it has exactly the same move, that it's the transcendental philosophical problematic, but weirdly altered by the fact that rather than this retrojective movement of trying to pull back out of the empirical self into the unknown dimension of the real self, the self in itself, so to speak. Instead, you do this forward move, first of all, totally dependent upon the cultural climate of electronic media, and the whole argument starts: if certain limited conditions are maintained, then it will definitely be the case that in the future our species will produce historical simulations of arbitrary accuracy. So it tracks towards these trends to do with computing power, to do with the kind of interests that are already exhibited in doing simulations of social and historical systems in the greatest possible detail, games, all of these kind of things. And to say, either our species is annihilated, or some massive roadblock happens in terms of simulation technologies, or by some act of self-abnegation, it is decided not to have these simulations take place. And all of these different, I mean, I don't know how you would weight the probabilities of these various things, but it probably looks as if species extinction is the most probable of the three, and that all of them can be given a relatively low probability. So in that case, he says, it will definitely be the case that there will be beings existing within computer simulations of extraordinary human scale complexity, whose entire function is to participate in a simulation, i.e. in an artificial reality, and therefore believe in that artificial reality, behave as agents in that artificial reality, etc., etc., etc. And track those processes forward to the final stage of this argument is to say, if that is true, and you find yourself in a world, you find yourself as an empirical ego in some credible world, you are overwhelmingly likely to actually be inside a computer simulation, because of all those kinds of beings, almost all of them are in computer simulations, and only some vanishingly insignificant proportion actually are, and we come back to this thing, the real beings. So I introduced that not only to just widen the scope of this, but because I think it directly ties up with your question here, which is that, so it starts off saying, look, imagine us creating in the future, our society creating these simulations and having these artificial beings, and they get confused about who they are. They think they're real, inverted commas, but actually they're just existing inside a computer simulation. And then it obviously does this then recoil move to say, well, by all the probabilistic logic of this argument, we ourselves must be those beings. And then in turn, so we have been simulated by some real beings outside our system. Now, originally, those real beings outside the simulation are us, aren't they? There are, we're thinking of ourselves simulating stuff in the future. But now, at this stage in the argument, when we see, well, are we in a simulation? Well, what are the real beings now? I mean, are they just like us, but they just happen instead to be real rather than computer simulations? Or is it that once again we've drawn this gulf now between everything we know as reality and that which is behind reality and running that reality and formatting that reality? Have we really got back to this deep transcendental question about what is a real self or a real agent? What is the population of the outside, which we've lost access to except by various complicated forms of analogy? I mean, sorry, that might seem a bit weird as a response to what.
Not at all. No, it's totally clear to me. It just deepens sort of, my thoughts and reflections on the issue as we need to do as much as we can, because as you said, it's incredibly complicated. Of course, Kant 101 is the notion that any experiencing being is already their experience is of course conditioned by the transcendental realm, and that's the transcendental amounts partially to the conditions of our possible experience. So
yeah,
I'm just saying that to keep that in my mind for myself, because it doesn't matter how far we go back. We could be sort of virtual world number 110, and keep taking a step back. But as long as it goes back to an experiencing being, we're not at the real. So for me, there's no chance that we are in that we are the noumena, so to speak. Even though
when you say we, I mean, this is exactly where on the crux of the issue. When you say we aren't the noumena, I mean, yes, if you're saying that which we identify empirically as ourselves cannot be the conditioning being, absolutely 100%. But of course, already for Kant, and then more strangely for all his successors, that conditioning being is really what we are. It's only the empirical ego is only our apparent self. It's only our stage presence, and the real you is the conditioning being that is directing the performance. And obviously Kant thinks we know quite a lot about that because he's being traditional about it, and the analogy is very strong between the sort of thing that is doing the performance and the sort of thing that is directing the performance. It's an individuated agent of a kind that we're sort of relatively confident we understand. But in many of the paths that people take off this problem, what is the director becomes extremely arcane question. You know. I mean, if I don't want to shut down this side of it because it's obviously the side of it that I find most totally gripping, but I mean, we can definitely move this in a more empirical direction to talk about some of these very practical issues about identity and privacy and protection of identity, and the way that this new format for identity is actually going to tie up with what has looked like a very different discussion about online privacy and online identity. And obviously, as I say, it seems to me there's two huge cultural formations on that other side already, which is tied up with the whole security surveillance side of it, and is tied up with this corporate marketing side of it. And both of those have engendered a massive amount of discussion and concern in various ways.
The advertisers, and this is true of the security complex as well on sort of a different scale of loops, but in the case of the advertisers in particular, the way in which gathering that data about you then is immediately indistinguishable or part of targeting stuff actually that's supposed to modify your behavior, and often succeeds in doing so, even for those of us who are kind of in principle resistant to buying what ads tell us to buy and so forth. With sufficiently good targeting in some areas, you're like, oh shit. It's actually kind of a distinct, I'm rambling here, but it's kind of a distinct feeling when, after being used to seeing a succession of ads that have no interest to you, suddenly Facebook hits it one day, and you get three that are just like, that's kind of creepy, actually, that it managed to find those. And so, to the extent that there's another, again, side to the loop that's modifying your behavior, it seems as if that is fundamentally different from the model of the transcendental versus empirical ego that, at least that Kant brings up, if not necessarily all of his successors. It seems as if the security and the advertising are part of this area where, I guess where the issue of self is different from the sort of absolute abstract divide between a real self and an empirical self that the philosophy is concerned with, and becomes like a cybernetic and material issue, where what you're talking about is, as you said, a nexus or bundle of communications that is constituting selves on both sides, a virtual self and the quote-unquote psychological self, a gentle self, whatever, that's puppet mastering it, or allegedly puppet mastering it.
Yeah. No, I think there's a really deep political and philosophical side to this, and there's a side that I think is immediately fascinating to talk to, which I've got to pick up on, because I think this thing about targeted advertising is hugely and fascinatingly paradoxical. It's right that you say it's meant to modify your behavior, if only in the sense that it's meant to get you to buy something that you wouldn't otherwise buy. I think everyone would have to accept that's the minimum of why, that's the minimum motivation for any kind of advertising activity. If it's not going to change that behavior.
Participation. You know, I mean, sites that don't necessarily charge you anything to sign up, but still advertise because they get something out of it.
To catch you somehow. Yeah. Yeah. But if you look, like you say, for instance, these Amazon recommendations, I mean, there's something extraordinarily interesting about the fact that it has got so inside your head that it's hard not to see it as a service. You know, when Amazon knows you so well that the books it suggests that you might be interested in are all books that you go, wow, that looks really interesting. You know, how did it know? How did it know I would want that? I mean, you know, it's easy to be sort of glib in one's stance of critique about this thing, and I'm not saying that those critiques are not interesting at all, but I think it's easy to be distracted from the fact that they really are things that are seductive.
Right.
And, you know, and that in most cases, when done well, this kind of targeted advertising, precisely because it is targeted, seems to be non-abusive to the people on the receiving end of it. It seems it is very easy for that kind of advertising to really seem as if it is doing something for you, helping you to know even better than you do yourself what it is you really are interested in. And I would be very surprised if overall, I mean, I think that this is it's going to be a big problem for formations of left critique about this advertising thing, is that it is winning a kind of tacit popular ideological war by simply being so much more appealing to people. You know, when you're bombarded by advertising of stuff you're not interested in, you know, that is trying to make you interested by some hard sell tactic, it's very easy for someone to come along and say to you, you're being abused, you know, this is annoying you, what's happening here, you're against it. It's not a big problem. But when advertising is targeted so well that you really are seeing these things and you're saying, hey, that product looks great, I'm so pleased that I've been told about it, then there's not the same latch for this kind of sense of political alienation or, you know, affront.
Except to the extent, except from maybe a libidinal economics perspective, where what's just happened is that you've succumbed to a more surgical or, you know, more powerful libidinal attack, or, you know, attack on your cognitive security, and so you become more dependent upon this system, and so, you know, you do it from a certain perspective, which, I mean, there has to be damages in order for that to be politically relevant, and so you have to kind of imagine that there's some attentional faculty or deep attention faculty or, you know, interest in the things that interest you that's being depleted or flattened out by this kind of thing. You know, Stiegler argues that. And I think there's got to be some truth to that. I mean, just like, you know, interactions with a smartphone over a long period of time will kind of show you that there's something is being done to your attentional faculties. It's still not entirely sure what, but, or whether it's irremediable, but I don't know. There's still some politics there, I think.
Okay, so something's done to your, like, something's done to something, right? I mean, tests on monkeys showed that they did this test. I don't know how many of you have read about it, right? They did this test a couple of years ago. Actually, I was reading about it in 2012. So it must be more than a couple of years ago, right? So basically, what they did was they changed. Basically, they forced the monkey to learn how to break through a window with a hammer to get to the banana, right? Instead of just grabbing the banana. And then they noticed immediately rewiring of neural systems and the shape of brain cells. Within a month or two of using the hammer, literally, the memory of holding the hammer and smashing into the glass had started to transform the monkey's brain.
God, Heidegger and Stiegler would love that. That's awesome.
Yeah. But it also would be a bit surprising if that wasn't true, wouldn't it? I mean,
sorry, Nick. What were you saying?
well, I was just going to say, but wouldn't it be surprising if that wasn't true? I mean, I'm assuming everyone thinks that the mind is run on the brain, and I mean, if the monkey has learnt something, isn't that necessarily going to be that there will be a set of changes in the brain that with sufficient resolution we can detect?
Well, yeah, but those aren't equivalent. I mean, changes that keep perpetuating more changes into the larger system. I mean, there's a big difference between changing the potentiation patterns of synapses to record that one memory. I've used, like, a muscle memory. I've used the hammer before, and a cascade of changes that's like, I used a tool to get to the thing that I want.
Right.
And, it involved gestures and this heavy object, and that was related to breaking a barrier. I mean, I assume that's what you're talking about, Mo, is that there was a cascade of changes.
Yes, no, but not only that, but also what Nick was saying, which is like we're basically we're empirically learning things that we could intuitively guess that they were true, right? It's like, okay, so yeah, so our tools transform our brain. Now, if you get that monkey to not use that tool for a long period, I bet those changes will like disappear, and then he'll move into another sort of like state, which is sort of like the old one plus the traces of the former new one, and now the new one, right? So it's like, I don't know, it's like every physical or virtual tool we use somehow transforms our sense of who we are and the way or like change or upsets the balance of our attentional resources, right? Or like the way we use them.
Yeah. For sure.
How do you determine in that particular example, though, what the authentic reflexes are? I mean, everything is conditioned to some degree, even the original authentic desires that are then being manipulated by advertising or whatever experiment that you're caught up in.
Yeah, totally.
How do you trace that back to some kind of
I'm
original design?
almost saying the same thing, but in from the other side, right? So it appears like me and Amy are disagreeing, but I'm trying to say big deal. Let's move on from this, right? Because there's no sort of like point of origin, or you know what I mean? There's no sort of like way of authenticating something prior to these tools.
Yeah.
Eventually, the desires that
crazy.
Amazon puts into your.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mo. I missed the last thing you said.
Sorry, I missed that last thing that you said there, Amy. What was that final statement?
I don't know. I think I'm lagging. I don't remember what I said. My brain's.
I don't think you're lagging. I can hear you perfectly.
Okay. Yeah, I don't.
I'm sorry, Mo. You said that only when monkey used hammer, it changed her brain, right?
Yes.
But it's I mean, it is nothing new in it. If we standing on the position of neurosciences, any our action will change our brain. Absolutely any action, any sort, and anything. If because all our thoughts, all our actions is chemical reactions, and I'm sorry. Okay, it's chemical reactions, and if it's chemical reactions, any reaction will change your brain. It will change the structure of the brain. Maybe it is not very radical change, but it is change.
No, for sure. But I think this is as much as it's significant, it's not significant.
how are you going to um, to 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 split significant and not significant change?
Well, significant is in a sense significant because it shows that there's nothing concrete about the biology, because this is not just like the changes that we're talking about in that study wasn't just like some fluid chemical changes, but actual changes to brain cells and to neurons, right? Like changes that are lasting, changes that are in the way the cells are now, the shape of the cells, right? But at the same time, I mean, so it's significant because we thought you think of biological entities as something fixed and like based on heredity, right? But then empirical data tells you that no, actually like certain actions will transform the biology, maybe not enough, like you said, to leave a lasting impact on the next generation, but for this particular biological unit, the changes are sort of like significant enough to show on our radar, right? So that is significant because to that extent. But if you come from a school of thought that already you kind of like speculate that everything's in flux and changing, it just kind of becomes like non-significant.
You never know what is significant. I mean, talking about okay, it's some of kind of jumped out of the theme, but if talking about physics, if we there are fluctuations, and you never know what fluctuation can change the system, and what fluctuation will have no real effect on the system.
Well, the thing is, the only thing that kind of becomes kind of interesting here in case of the humans, I mean, what I'm saying is nothing important. I'm just wasting time, right? But I just want to like seriously, what becomes significant is the fact that when you become aware of the changes that have happened in the way you use.
Well, no, you still there? Or am I interrupting you, or you just disappeared? Okay, I think he's frozen out.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I was just going to say that, and this absorbs the becoming aware of to a certain extent, but more it's saying that the fact that you can't know it in advance doesn't mean there isn't a distinction between the significant and the non-significant. It's that it appears after the fact, and where it's sort of like, Deleuze's account of habitus, where it triggers a self-organizing change in the system that it is a change to. So, you have where the cyclone can be understood as the self-organization that makes the, butterflies flap of its wings, the initial small perturbation, have been significant. So the perturbation isn't significant at the time in itself, but it will have been to the extent that it triggers a self-organizing behavior. And so, I mean, we can view like awareness that, my awareness that I have changed, whether it's an awareness that it's on account of this small chemical change or not, as a self-organizing change, but it's not necessarily the only one either. Whereas like before, the small change of the addition of a memory of using a hammer can create a self-organizing change in the neocortex's position towards technics or to technical gestures, or contact with an antigen causes a self-organizing reaction in the immune system, etc. So that small changes can get picked out later as significant by the way they affect the system's self-interaction. That's what I'd argue would be, in this context at least, would be the threshold of significance.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, so I guess I was trying to say the same thing when it froze. So I came and connected myself like literally to the network, so I don't go through these kind of like up and downs. But I think I was saying the same thing, right, Jake?
Yeah, I think so. I was kind of distracted by the
once you
group
become
chat.
once you become aware of like traces of these like changes, it gets into a different mode, because then you can kind of like think about it. I don't know, but yeah, Danielle also is saying something on the sidebar that maybe he wants to like articulate it himself, or I don't understand what he means by QCT, but
Question concerning technology.
technology.
The later Heidegger text.
Yeah, totally, man. I know
Yeah,
that.
we're off on a sidebar a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Nick, do you want to continue?
Well, I mean, there was a thread that came to a certain kind of point of criticality, I thought, with Jake's point about this this whole new advertising environment that we're in. That, I mean, it's slightly off our main beat, but it's an issue that I think is extremely fascinating, to do with this whole question about complicity. And, you know, the point Jake was making as a kind of riposte, but this isn't something that I would want to have disagreed with initially, about there's still a kind of politics, and there's still a position of critical negativity open in this. And the question that I want to raise is, well, what happens to that position? Because I think something really systematic happens to it. You know, it's like I'm not at all denying that it's there, but I think it undergoes this extraordinary mutation because of the fact that it loses its ground in immediate, any sort of immediate sense of abuse, and it's therefore driven up into a sort of meta level. It's like this whole technology, if you were sort of looking at it from, in a way, the very perverse position of sort of quasi-academic political critique, is actually an engine of abstraction, because it no longer is actually being fed by this ground level outrage. You know, as we're saying, people are getting this targeting advertising. It's changing their brains, as we've said. I mean, it's kind of totally invading them at this very intimate level, to such an extent that it seems like them. You know, so Amazon, which I'm using that example only because I know it best, it really seems almost that it's like some kind of doppelganger that is so deeply inside your head that it's thinking certain things for you more authentically than you ever were able to think them yourself, and more knowledgeably, you know, and says you're the sort of person who likes this book even though you've never heard about it, and you have to say, you're right, you know, I wish I was the sort of person who already had known that that book had existed. Thank you, my second Amazon self, for doing me better than I was doing myself. And when you've got people in that position, it's obviously deeply complicated to muster a kind of momentum of political critique in traditional ways. I mean, you can't say, you know, I know you hate this and we're going to help you get rid of it, because people are absolutely so entangled, almost amorously, with this thing that is being done to them, that the notion that they're being subjected to something abhorrent has to then be carefully produced by an extremely elaborate sort of meta discourse. Sorry, I don't know what happened then.
No, there's some. I'm just gonna like mute. Yeah, it's just a question of muting. I think I'm just gonna mute Jake. Go ahead.
Yes, no, I think I'm sort of done with that. It's just to say, I think that there's a strange systemic relationship between forms of, you know, highly intellectualized political critique and some of these developments that are happening in particularly social media, where you can't decompose it. They're working together as a system, however reluctantly, in that one undergoes a set of transformations irresistibly because of what is happening at the other level. if level is not a good way of talking about it, I suspect.
Can I add something to this?
Yes, for sure.
Okay, yeah, I totally agree with the fact that, I mean, some of the critiques that do micro-targeting and everything get a bit, as you said, abstract, I think. But I think there is another level to data profiling and mining and quantifying, which is precisely the trading of data. I think that is actually the disturbing. I mean, it's fine. It's Amazon, it's recommending me books that I actually may be interested in reading.
Right.
But the fact is that when Amazon sells my data to banks, financial institutions, whatever, to decide what is my credit, whatever rate, and I don't know. I think.
So are you? Sorry, go ahead. Finish what you're saying.
No. I was just saying, yeah. I think that is the very disturbing element.
No, that's critically important. Definitely critically important. And it's obviously you get back to this split between these two levels of the self. There's there's the IRL identity, and then there's this burgeoning, developing, rapidly evolving virtual persona that finds itself involved in these commercial processes that are opaque. I mean, there's commercial processes that is engaged in itself, but then, like you say, there are these commercial processes that it only learns about indirectly because someone tells them that, did you know that there was a trade in all of this bundled personal data taking place? Yeah, it's an absolutely fascinating issue for sure. It still seems to me, though, that, and I'm not being critical in saying this. When I talk about this pressure towards a certain type of abstraction, I don't mean that to say dismissively at all. I find all drives towards abstraction extremely interesting. I'm simply saying that in order to even make the point that you've made, which I agree is extremely crucial, you are already still taken up to a certain higher level of abstraction because you're dealing with things that are happening to people's virtual persona. So you're already assuming that they are taking a kind of interest, a moral political interest in this new level of the empirical self or formatted identity. That's a completely new thing. I mean, no one had these things. Obviously on a philosophical level, everyone's always had an empirical ego, but no one had virtual persona only a few decades ago. And you don't even have to go back that far before they were so crude and deliberate and experimental that there was no comparison. So this is something extremely recent that's happened to people, where you now have to say you now have these additional selves that have become critical elements of commercial and political reality, and you have to start taking it seriously. And this is a challenge, I think, rather than in a conventional environment where things are happening to people's real lives and you just say, look what's happening to you, or you hate being on that production line, or these kind of things. Now you really have to say, you have to switch levels in order to start addressing this process.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, with regards to what Laura specifically said, or the specific thing that she found disturbing, which was trading into financial institutions that determine your credit, and then sort of an equivalent would be like insurers and your healthcare premium, that sort of thing. I mean, it's not that much older, but that problematic predates virtual, like literally virtual selves being the issue. So you've got you've still got you've got an actuarial self. Or whatever it is that's you smoke or whatever, and does that information get communicated to a healthcare, which parts of your financial life get communicated to a bank? And so it's that interaction with institutions that we already understand is problematic with regard to, that kind of concretely problematizes this relatively abstract problem.
Yeah, so
the data self.
Jake, so like your credit score was already a virtual self.
Right, or to some extent, it's at least comparable.
because you missed your payment on your electricity bill, and then somehow it would update itself. And
yeah, I
then
mean,
now
this is
your score is
retrospective,
lower,
but it's
and
all
you're
data.
like, oh shit, people will find out about it, right? And then there was always, there were like public records of people who sued you, or like if you did stuff that would end up in public like ledgers, right? Like say if somebody like, if you were accused of something, right? And these databases were not available digitally to people because there were no internet, right? But now a lot of them you can actually search and find out about.
Yeah, and to some extent, the least virtual of those, or the least analogous, would be that, a background check. Like, have you personally stolen from some other person personally, showed up at court and gotten this charge, but like, your interaction with healthcare systems or usage of credit cards, it doesn't even almost need to be observed by any particular human or linked up in any really fundamental way with you. You can just have, like lived at this place briefly and a rent bill didn't get paid, or you used a credit card and no one ever really, took note of you using this credit card in the wrong way, but it percolates into your data footprint, into your financial data footprint. And that was true even before that was, a network entity necessarily.
But if we go back to this this section 10 of this Satoshi Nakamoto paper, and this basic point he's making about the switch of this gulf between the private and the public, from one that bundles all the participants and everybody involved in the transaction on one side, and then breaks with the public, and then on the other you've got the break happening between your real and virtual persona. I mean, doesn't that impinge on what you're saying there? Like, all this prehistory, where it's to do with your credit scores, criminal records, actuarial factors, all of these kind of things, are all being synthesized on something very close to your, let me say, conventional real identity. You know what I mean? They're cross-media. Maybe some of them have involved computer systems or just on paper or bureaucracies, different media. Yes, they've all got their own formatting systems, but there's no coherent self being implied by that constellation of information other than you in the most conventional sense of that self-identification.
Right. No, I agree.
Whereas now we're crossing into this, I think, different zone where the nexus of constellation, the nexus of synthesis, is entirely within this new media system. And there is room, like if we go back to Laura's question, which I think is, try and bring these things together more. And let's just say you were really upset about, I'm changing it slightly or specifying it just to say, make it more concrete and say you're really upset about the way that the information that has accumulated on your Facebook ID is being treated by Facebook as a company, and it's being released to other people, sold to other people. In some ways, you have a problem with the way that constellation of information is now being manipulated or commercialized. It would be possible to fall back on this same boundary that is drawn between your Bitcoin account and your IRL person to say, I need to make a much stronger and more secure gulf between that Facebook avatar and my real self. That is now the bulwark of resistance in this. It's to say it's gone. The Facebook identity is lost. I can't protect it. It's like completely, all kinds of people are fishing what they want from it and using it in any way they want, and it's completely beyond protection. So the line of protection has to be drawn within the self, between its virtual apparition and its real existence. And it's the problem has been that gulf wasn't being taken seriously enough. It was too new. People didn't understand what they were doing. They naively over-identified with their avatars And so your Facebook page, it never occurred to you that this was something that should be strategically performed because your avatar was going to be utterly vulnerable, and any security you had to happen between you and your avatar, not within the avatar itself.
Nick, can I say something?
Yes, of course.
This is something that I've been kind of interested in for many years because I actually have an interest in fashion. My mother was a fashion designer, and I noticed this shift right around the same time as this whole digital, like what you just identified in terms of like people's sort of naivety around the notion of like your virtual self and all that. So like already played out in the way fashion was used, say in the last, like in the 20th century, and culminating almost in the last decade of the 20th century, right? Fashion was something that was a place where you displayed yourself, your subjectivity, your differences, your uniqueness, right? Whereas as we moved into 21st century, more and more, fashion is becoming a kind of a conscious mask in order to market yourself or make yourself available to the world in the ways you want. And so what you wear no longer is about you displaying who you are to the world, but to sort of cleverly putting out a version of you for a particular sort of like for a particular setting. So if you're going to like meet with lawyers, you're gonna dress this way, and if you're gonna like go hang out with your friends who are gonna smoke pot, you're gonna like dress that way, because you want to appeal to these, you know what I mean? If you have a business meeting, you know what I mean? And these things are becoming, like, people are becoming much more conscious of how they use this mask of fashion. And I think, and I think this is happening in people's relationship with their avatars.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Yeah. Yeah. I think that there's a whole thing about that the self has an element of puppetry about it that would previously not be unfamiliar to philosophers, but in ordinary existence would seem like a kind of weird esoteric suggestion of little practical relevance that is being made utterly practical, in the sense that if you maintain an entire naivety about the actual way you deploy these avatars, like in fashion, as you say, or all of these different zones, then you simply are not coping competently with the new environments that we're operating in.
Nick, I had a quick question relating to what you said about it. Say Coca-Cola being flattened to the level of a virtual identity or a Bitcoin self. I think that mainlining is very interesting, but I guess my question is, couldn't Coca-Cola then do that same proliferation of avatars? And I don't know, if Bitcoin is the only data that can distinguish these, or how many Bitcoins you have, distinguish these identities from one another, how do they, or couldn't these companies take advantage of this, and couldn't the underserved perhaps not be able to access it? Like, couldn't there be a tipping point, so to speak, not to invoke Gladwell, but whereby Bitcoin took off and these companies jumped in, and the homogeneous, the same virtual flat identity that we could have couldn't keep up? Or is there some way that the decentralization could keep all of this exchange in check, if that's a legit question?
Yes, for sure it is. I mean, it's obviously a difficult one. Sorry. I'm just getting sort of have domestic notes being passed around where which beds my children are sleeping.
That's fine. Think on it.
No, I think this is crucial, and to me it goes to this point, actually, we were talking about a bit last week, about this, what's already involved in this peer-to-peer thing, because I think there's no way it's possible to confidently speculate about the way this kind of things turn out. But I think we can definitely see that it has a pedigree with which we're very familiar, which is that these very traditional questions about what is involved in the notion of formal equality or peer-to-peer relations is obviously taken to this omega point on Bitcoin. And any worries you might have previously had about, in the widest sense and most classical sense, liberal socioeconomic arrangements is just driven up to this absolutely hysterical situation, because it's not only corporations. I mean, literally, you can start slotting anything into this zone of the real self, anything you like, So if you treat it as a game that is at least partly competitive and even hostile, then you really don't know who you're playing this game against. I mean, all you have are these avatar characters that, as you say, might be fragments of some mega corporation, might be parts of some weird techno-intelligence system that you don't yet understand. I mean, you simply cannot know, because all you have is the promise of formal equality between nodes with deliberately stripped of all substance. So I think there's a huge future for elaborate, techno-savvy, massively paranoid left critiques of the new Bitcoin internet. I mean, I think that will be absolutely huge and fascinating thing to happen. I mean, and I think that in your question, you'll sort of have some embryonic growth of that visible.
Potentially.
I mean, sorry, I won't babble on about this, but just to say, obviously the reference that is just screaming out to be said is the situationist, and the whole thing about the spectacle as a kind of paranoia machine, that it's the thing behind the spectacle that you're not seeing, and the spectacle is in control. I mean, now, we're in an environment where all of that type of systematic political paranoia can just be cranked up to 11 without any difficulty whatsoever.
Since it's all visible.
That's why Guy Debord wrote like the text that would just keep on giving. It's like that's why that text is like never gonna go away in a certain type of mindsets, right? It's just that text just keeps giving the same thing in and it's like it's crazy.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, thanks.
What about fake accounts, fake profiles? If someone will make a fake profile of me, for example, or maybe profile of some celebrity, is it some kind of a steal of identity, of part of identity, or what is it then?
Yes. Okay, I mean, now this is something that we immediately have to partition off from Bitcoin, because it simply cannot happen in Bitcoin. But in all these other zones we've been talking about, for sure. And it seems to me there's two dimensions of this. One is to do with the relation that's crossing this rift, that someone is able to accumulate information about your real identity and can construct an avatar of that in some media system. And have they sort of sucked out and vampirically stolen your identity and stuck it to cyberspace? Or there's this horizontal, more contagious model where you already have put a whole bunch of material into a virtual identity, and that's being cloned or copied or in some way sucked out of your virtual personality and reproduced in some monstrous form or some double that is horrible to you. And I can definitely see that both of those are almost certainly going to happen a lot, in more and more horrific ways. So I think, yeah, for sure.
Our name is Legion because we are many.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this whole, as we know from the whole Bitcoin thing, that the baseline of all digital systems is perfect facility at cloning. It's why the double spending problem is the sort of starting point of the whole thing. And so all these problems to do with doubling, replication, which have always been a staple of horror identity as far back as you want to go, are now operationalized in an extremely smooth fashion. And I mean, there's a lot of fascinating stuff about Bitcoin with this that, again, I won't get too lost in this because it's something we'll come back to. It's totally fascinating. Is that, of course, it sort of starts with the double spending problem, and it totally addresses that in this focused fashion because it knows that it's in this medium where copying, cloning is completely or effectively free. And with a certain self-satisfaction. I mean, I love it, so I'm not trying to be cruel in this, but with a certain self-satisfaction, it sort of says, we've solved the double spending problem, but that everything in this medium is open to those vulnerabilities. So, people clone Bitcoin websites, they clone Bitcoin institutions, they clone Bitcoin exchanges, they clone the whole Bitcoin system into these various different cryptocurrencies. All the way down, whatever level, there is this massive process of duplication that I do think came as a bit of a surprise in the sense that everyone thought, well, what if you made, the whole issue was programmed by the previous financial history where the whole thing was, what if you duplicate this currency unit? No one was thinking, well, what if you duplicate these entire institutions? And so someone who's trying to go to some part of what they think is the trusted Bitcoin infrastructure finds themselves on some scam website, the Bitcoin institution or whatever it is that's just fractionally changed and is representing itself to you as being part of this system designed to eliminate the double spending problem and the duplicity and the doubling of the sign, and is itself actually a doubling that has been totally produced in order to scam you at this meta level. So yeah, I think there's no end to the level of appropriate paranoia is beyond anything that probably is humanly imaginable in this situation.
Yeah, I mean, once you start, I was just thinking of, I think it's Mona Lisa Overdrive is the one where most explicitly, I mean, you have these psych profiles mentioned that allow someone to, buy the ability to predict someone's actions better than that person could, so that you can come before them, you can see how they're going to react to a certain way of approaching them in advance. And it seems like that's kind of an essential threshold where this doppling of yourself or your data self, yourself into your data self, becomes just essentially problematic, is when the doppled data self can literally come before the quote-unquote real self, is a better predictor of, or has the power to determine the actions of the real self in advance.
Yeah,
to some extent.
Definitely. I mean, that's an aspect of this whole thing about all these worries that people have about what might happen to their virtual avatar. Obviously, are actually indistinguishable from some kind of cloning. I mean, it's that if someone can traffic your information, it's because everything that has been synthesized as you within a certain virtual format can simply be copied and circulated as something that can then be poked apart in some software laboratory somewhere by an automatic system. But then, obviously, then these DAOs, which we haven't, I've got to make sure we schedule a nice big chunk and everyone gets prepared for that, because they are just, I think everyone ultimately, that's the most interesting thing. And it really is with these things that the whole question of artificial intelligence has just crossed a line automatically and immediately from being wild scientific speculation to being just part of our social environment. I mean, as soon as you have the model of a DAO being seriously entertained and people working on it, you're basically already saying, how are artificial intelligences going to fit into this particular social milieu? And I mean, of course, people can respond to that saying, oh, come on, no one is going to get these things to work, as they do in many other parts of the AI debate. But I honestly think it's unlikely that people are saying that. When people read the Vitalik Buterin material, are they really saying to themselves, there's no way you could get one of these things to operate? I mean, all it has to do to get started is just have a little knot of commercially consistent activity. It just has to earn itself enough bitcoins to cover its own running expenses. And obviously on Moore's law, those running expenses are heading towards zero, and it can find any service open on the net it can operate in order to just get some tiny little trickle of those that they call the Bitcoin microfragment Satoshis, some tiny little trickle of Satoshis, and it's alive then, and maybe it's just a bug, but it's there. Buterin, who I adore because of the fact he's such a lunatic in this respect, is saying, look, we're going to make these things Turing complete, open-ended prospect for them to improve their own performance, and then we're going to release them and see what happens. I mean, it's just canned cyber apocalypse. There's no, you couldn't do more to just totally let everything come howling out of Pandora's box than that. And it's like just happening. I mean, we're now there. That is the cusp. That is our contemporary reality.
Nick, did you just say contemporary reality?
Contemporary reality.
Oh, I thought you couldn't combine it into the same word.
No, but that would be nice. I'll have to go and piddle around with it on the word processor later. So I think we've got like one significant topic spasm of time left, if anyone has some inspiration in that respect. I don't know. Yeah.
Sorry, just a general comment that, and I started thinking about this the other day. Zizek has been in Los Angeles. I actually asked him what he thought about Bitcoin, and he said he couldn't answer me seriously because he doesn't know that much about it, which I thought was interesting. But
that's so good. I wish you recorded him. Finally, he one thing he's not going to blab about.
It was strange. Yeah, he really couldn't. Yeah. He said, I can't answer you seriously about this, but I will tell you about how this. I forgot what country he was referring to and what government just started printing money and how this was a big problem and stuff. But I think it is recorded, by the way, Mo. If you want to hear it sometime, I'll pass it to you. But what I wanted to say was that I was thinking about the double spending problem, and during the past hour, there's been a going back and forth between literally the double spending problem with regards to currency and then also the notion of identity. And there's kind of a doubling problem there. Well, with this idea of having a fake identity, the one you present versus the one behind the scenes. And Zizek was talking about this idea that that he thinks, when we have these people who have these formal identities, that we shouldn't allow them to then show their human side in order to gain favor in the political sphere. That we should just force them into the role, like the president should just always be the president. He should never show his human side. Right. But I digress. My point is just that it's fascinating to me that and maybe I'm going too far here, that the double spending problem and what I'll just call this double identity problem are collapsing in our questioning about Bitcoin.
Yeah. No, but I think that collapse is not just us doing it. I think that collapse is massively happening, for sure. I mean, what's really interesting, if you follow this through just on the cryptographic thread, there is an almost complete collapse of the distinction between what is a currency system and what is a system of identity. I mean, you lose the sense of crossing from one to the other almost automatically, because you go back to the start of the paper here, and of course, sorry, let me just, I think I might, I'm just going to give myself 1 second to find it. If not, I'll just use my, sorry, I'm just going to gloss it, paraphrase it. If I get it totally wrong, people can embarrass me about it later. That he says, we define a coin as a chain of signatures. So that's really the cryptographic definition of identity and the Bitcoin definition of money are completely conflated. You know, there's nothing to what the money is that is not made up out of the resolution to a problem of identity. And so that you'll see in all the more interesting, serious, and less scammy altcoin models, the first ones and the most serious ones tend to be about identity problems to do with credentialization, to do with various kind of problems that they still actually have to operate as if they were a currency to make this system work. But what they're really doing is just establishing identity, establishing authenticity, establishing like one whole model. Is called just proof of existence. You know, it simply works to show that something actually existed actually at a certain time. Because as we know, this sort of time structure is at the core of what the blockchain does. So I think what you're saying is totally right, except I don't think we're, you know, confusing these things. I think we're simply picking up on the fact that they are being historically massively run together.
Yeah.
Nick, I also wanted to like ask a dumb question, if you don't mind.
I'd be thrilled.
Okay. Actually, maybe it's a two-part dumb question, or two dumb questions together. So maybe dumb times dumb makes it smart, like negative times negative, but I doubt it. So the first question is, do you think like we can look at like movement from social media and online avatar identity into Bitcoin identity, which is much more sort of like solid, and in which this divide between real and what's virtual is more sort of like more apparent to the user, and the way in which these are used. Like, so basically we're moving from this type of social media identity into a Bitcoin identity, so it's historical.
Right.
That's one question.
Yeah.
I mean, even though they're going to coexist for a long time. Second one is how, you know, because the way Bitcoin gives you, the way Bitcoins generate value for you, we already know how Bitcoin works. But what if your data footprint in terms of like the user of all these multiple social networks can somehow itself be economized in a way that can actually be integrated into Bitcoin, or create a sort of like a Pierre Bourdieuian secondary virtual economy, kind of like a cultural capital Bitcoin, which is about sort of like, you know, your clout, the likes you get, how much, you know what I mean, traffic your posts will generate, or like how many friends you have and how much influence you have. Somehow you're going to end up with another different like real money economy, or one that is actually incorporated into a Bitcoin easily.
Right.
So
yeah, no, I think they're both great actually. Can I take them in the order that you raised them?
sure.
I think
sure.
that because I think the first question, there's lots of ways we could approach it. I mean, my initial crude answer would be just to say yes, but I think that obviously requires more. And I think it's really interesting to fold your question now back onto the issues that Laura's raising, and turn it into another question, or relate it to another question, which is to say, maybe even ask Laura, is it possible to actually have a defensive position in this virtual environment? Like, let's say that our big worry is these kind of things that are being done to our virtual identities. And again, I'll just take Facebook as an example of just say that you've built up, some naive person has built up this massive Facebook nucleated virtual identity, and then realize with his shock horror after reading some article that this identity is being subject to a whole bunch of processes of whatever kind we can choose. Commercial maybe is the most obvious, but as I say, I think these policing and security issues that we could bring in as well, and and wants to respond to that. Where Mo is coming from here, or what's raised by Mo's thing, is just, I'm reading it as saying we just have to give up on that as a possible line of defense. Like, it's hopeless, it's indefensible. And that Bitcoin is teaching us, what the hell were you thinking to have tied up your real identity and this avatar in such a way that this disaster is now befalling you. But to turn it into a question is to say, is it that there is either alongside or even as a superior response a possibility of saying, no, we can actually take action on the plane of the virtual environment and do something about this, without falling back across this rift that is defending, our pseudonymous online identity from our real identity. I mean, don't feel like I'm rushing you. You don't have to answer to it at all, or you can simply kick it down the pitch if you want to. But it seems
definitely. It's like what you're suggesting is totally like reasonable to be considered.
Yeah. I don't know. First of all, let me apologize. I think I'm starting to fade a bit. It's like quite late here, 2 a.m.
Right. Sure.
But I think, I don't know. Obviously, Bitcoin is pointing towards a big issue that, and also I think I just wanted to clarify before when I was saying that the fact that now, my data can be, I don't know, profiled into different ways and so that didn't mean like disturbing I mean, obviously it's like a disturbing thing perhaps for me, but I meant to say that it's anyway like a radically different way of perhaps profiling entities. I don't know, in reply to what Jake said before in terms of like what he was saying about the fact that like these modes of profiling have always existed. Yes, but now I think there are some other kinds of formatting agencies, which are obviously like algorithms that create this kind of endless chain of repackaging of data and reprofiling data that are somehow considered anonymous still, because supposedly they're not personal, like there's not my name on this, but somehow they still end up managing, to bring it back to me or to that virtual identity that somehow represents me. But I think the other point is perhaps the fact that before Bitcoin pointed to the fact that, I mean, to the complex relation in between perhaps the empirical and the transcendental identities, I guess, or well, anyway, the formatted and then I think there was no other alternative, right? I mean, someone else built a network the way it is for some kind of reason. I think, I mean, what Bitcoin is pointing towards, or is like, I guess, addressing, is a complete reformatting of, you know, of the way in which relations or lines are formed and of our way of thinking about it, I guess. So I don't know if this answered the question in any way.
Yeah, no, it's definitely closely connected for sure, and it's fascinating. I mean, you know, obviously we could spend a whole block of this on Facebook easily, but there's something I have to admit that I find something deeply malignant about Facebook, and until Bitcoin came along, it had almost ruined all my attachment to the internet on a certain level. I mean, I just thought, oh my God, they wrecked the internet. You know, there was this amazing thing happening, and then Facebook happened, and oh my God, what is this? Because the whole principle of it is about just uploading your identity in the most crass possible fashion onto the web. You know, and people were using the internet for all this amazing stuff, and then suddenly they're simply saying, hey, this is me, with as much naivety and narcissism as could conceivably be kind of triggered and mustered from them. And, you know, I mean, it's not really appropriate to react to this sort of thing with just revulsion, but I have to just confess that that was the sort of just visceral response that I had to this happening. So, you know, I think Facebook does bring up this sort of problem in a really strong way, because it really just sucked people into these virtual avatars in the most helpless, pitiful, unreflective, vulnerable way that it could possibly be done. You know, and I think that that's traceable back to its history. You know, as the whole thing about starting off in university as some kind of weird kind of dating type project, you know, where it's just like, if you were going to say, from looking back from the perspective of Bitcoin, how could you encourage people in an internet, on the internet, to behave in the most stupid possible way? It would look like Facebook. You know, it would be perfectly designed to do that thing. So yeah, I do think it's a special case of this problem.
No, I agree as well. I guess, yeah, I left Facebook a couple of years ago, I guess, for very similar reasons. And still I know that my data are all in there and I can't really do much about it. Like, but that's true. That's very true. Yeah.
Nick, I also wanted to sorry.
Yeah. Sorry, Mo, yeah.
I also wanted to because you talk about how Facebook started as a dating site, right?
I mean, I might be misrepresenting it a little bit.
But people don't understand. This is like a total line of work that needs to get done by some scholars, and I actually don't. Maybe some of it is actually done, but I doubt it because I would have heard about it. Which is sort of like the idea that queer people, but particularly homosexual men, were on the forefront of avataring and forefront of particularly developing a very specific type of avatar for a type of exchange, which is sexual exchange, right? That was sort of involved certain types of personal revealing for certain type of exchanges. And this goes back to prior to HTTP. This goes back to news groups, and we're talking pre Netscape time, right? And then the more contemporary incarnation of it is the gay apps, right? Which basically kind of perfect that type of avataring, which is avataring with a particular use of sexual exchange. So it's almost like Facebook, but minus all those mindless stupidities, because the user knows why this avatar is made, how the avatar's appearance is supposed to function, and what's going to bring that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's very different than Facebook.
Well, some at least.
It's more like Bitcoin.
Yeah, except that I'm taking it from what you're saying that there is that the bridge between the two sides of the self is crucial to it functioning. So, if it's designed for some sort of sexual exchange, then the avatar, the whole point is that however strategically and with whatever kind of paranoia, the avatar has to be linked to the real self in order to kind of conclude in this sexual exchange. Is that right? Whereas, I mean, with Bitcoin, it's like you don't ever want that line to be crossed. As we've seen, you have to have these off ramps and on ramps in order to move money in and out of Bitcoin. But though you don't ever want to set up a bridge between your on-system formatted Bitcoin ID and your real ID. The whole thing has that. I mean, it's coming out of this culture again. I'm sorry to be using paranoia so much, but it's relevant in a lot of different contexts. And this is another kind of paranoia. This is coming out of this whole extreme cypherpunk anarcho culture of hackers, where these questions of absolute identity security are just at the front of their minds all the time, and so that's why it's totally the anti-Facebook. There's no way Dread Pirate Roberts is going to put a picture of his cat on Bitcoin. I mean, it just doesn't figure in the horizon of possibilities. He's not wanting anyone to find out anything about him at all. Whereas obviously Facebook is the other extreme, where it's all about simply letting it all hang out on the web. And the example Mo's giving is this complicated, nuanced interzone, isn't it? In the sense that because it's a problem, because there are sources of paranoia there involved, it's not a let it all hang out situation. But at the same time, at the end of the day, it's about making a connection that's actually going to cross this identity split. If your avatar was such that when it actually came to some kind of contact, the response was, "What the hell? I thought you were a cat." Then the whole thing's failed completely. I'm assuming. Is that right?
Yes. But it doesn't necessarily reflect back on the avatar or like in a real world. This is what's interesting about about the type of exchange I was talking about, because there's no way to reflect back the actual exchange that happens outside of the sex app back into the users in the app.
Right.
So if someone present themselves as like something else, and then in an actual encounter, it ends up being verified that it wasn't, there's no way for that information to go back into the system. Like there's no review system that somebody come and say, "Oh, that guy is not as handsome as he pretends to be. Don't date him," or like, "Oh, he like he's a crazy guy. He's a killer.
Right.
Don't date him. He's a killer. He's a serial killer. He almost murdered." There's no way to put that back. Whereas with Facebook, we all know how it works. It's constantly looping back, right?
Right. I mean, actually, because I dropped your second question, Mo, and now you've got a route back to it again. Because obviously, it doesn't answer your full question, which is something I hope we can continually return to, about this thing about economizing these various dimensions of online credit in the widest sense, like reputational credit, everything that's involved in these various kind of stats or measures of prestige, I guess, in various ways. But it definitely does seem to be the case in the example that you're just giving now, that some system of credentials would have been functionally essential to that system. Like, why did any of these avatars have any credibility at all if there's no system of monitoring, feedback, you know, they're simply unchecked, wild fantasies can be projected out into the system, and there's no comeback on that at any stage. I'm not understanding how that could work. Maybe I don't know whether
Maybe
most are
Virginia
with.
should chime in here as.
Yeah, for sure.
No, I'm here. I'm contemplating. I'm trying to see if that was a question for me. Should I say something or?
Yeah, I mean, well, anyone is open to this. I mean, if Amy thinks Virginia is pre-programmed to respond to this question. Did you catch the whole thing that Mo was talking about here, Virginia? You got the whole backstory to this.
Yeah, I did.
Right.
I did. I've been just half sleeping and half listening because I've just had a 10-hour drive. But anyway, yeah. So I suppose I was thinking about the pre-Netscape avatar. Constructions and whether or not those were economizable or whatever, and Facebook and that Facebook is this kind of dumbed down kind of network, I suppose, and also how in the pre-Netscape, so for example Lambda Mu or Mus and Muds, that there was a much more of a downloading of. I'm
so glad you said that. I was just about to talk about that, but go ahead. Thank you.
Downloading of
pornography.
Whatever.
That were.
Oh no! Much more of a making of pornography by the avatar.
Yeah, making it, but also downloading things that like seem to have value at that particular point in terms of its digital worth, right? Like a lot of people like downloading music, downloading movies, downloading things was like a big part of those pre-Netscape avatars.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm half asleep. I'm just going to have a think for a second.
Sure, that's good. Don't be rushed, because I mean that's already, I think, really interesting. Is this thing that obviously there's been this tidal reversal, hasn't it, from a thing where you have some kind of avatar, initially very minimalistic, that is just an access point for you to suck stuff off the web, and at a certain point, that behavior, that system of acquisitions, becomes itself a form of identity formation, which I think has to involve, a complex set of technical developments and just simply quantitative increases in capacity for storing and registering and compiling and integrating data. But the present situation is where when you now take things off the web, you're actually defining yourself on the web as the sort of person who takes this off the web, down to this fine-grained things, to what you've looked at, what magazine articles, what you've clicked on, all of that, all your consumption is now part of your identity formation, which is why you get to this whole issue that Laura's been talking about. It's because increasingly that's seamlessly integrated, and people now know what you've looked at, what kind of keywords, Google search words you're interested in. All your modes of online consumption are now actually being synthesized as this virtual persona, which becomes massively rich because of that. It's like quite quickly with some sort of active online life, the amount of these decisions and choices and options that you've made is huge and gives a very fine-grained picture of the kind of things you're interested in, the kind of things that you definitely not interested in, the kind of things obviously that you might want to buy, and all of these forms of orientation, whether it's consumer orientation, sexual orientation, political orientation, in fine-grained detail now adhered, glued together on this virtual avatar. So, I mean, the distance that's been traveled from these moo and mud type things where it was really very much a theatrical thing, that you create a character who you think you'd like to create and be represented by. This is automatic, and it's created by what you do, not by your idea of what you would like to be or how you would like people to see you.
Yeah, I think Virginia is just kind of confirming some of the stuff you were saying on the sidebar. Anyways, it's 9:20, and we were supposed to basically be done 7:30 to 7 to 8 to 9. Yeah, we're still 10 minutes from the class to officially end, and then since we started actually 10 minutes late, we got about 20 minutes of time left for the seminar. We went way over time last time, so it will be perfectly fine. If people feel like they want to finish here, we can. But if there's questions or people think they have something to add, I think officially we can have 20 more minutes before the class ends.
I was curious, Nick, that one of the videos you recommended in the classroom was an interview with an economist, I believe, maybe even the president of Harvard University at some point.
It's not the Larry Summers one you're talking about.
The financial museum.
Oh yeah, that was Larry Summers. I thought that was a very interesting video.
Yeah, I was just curious if maybe we could talk about that for a second. I didn't have a specific question, but I thought he had a very moderate position, right, for lack of a better way of putting it, where it was kind of like, for Bitcoin to take off, it's going to need to be regulated. Yeah. It was sort of like it's going to have to combine with the current norm. It's not going to be a revolution, so to speak, but it will have important consequences.
Right.
Sort of my yeah. Anyways, I'm interested in what your thoughts on that were.
Yeah. Well, from my sort of readings around the discussions taking place within what, for want of a better expression, but I hate this one, so it really is something being used as a disposable thing, the Bitcoin community, there is one overwhelmingly important argument taking place in it. You know, there's lots of interesting stuff happening around the edge or whatever, but when you're inside it, there's only one fundamental argument, which has different aspects to it, and it's between what I would describe as ultras and mainstreamers. And the ultras are very, very sharp, energized people who you will find concentrated in, like, the Nakamoto Institute site, which is excellent, and a lot of the sort of dedicated Bitcoin media represent them a lot. I'll provide some names. I mean, I've used them before. You know, Daniel Goldstein, Pierre Rochard, Daniel Kravitz. There's a bunch of these guys. But if you go through the Nakamoto Institute, what's called meme pool, memory pool, all that stuff is there, and it's a very, very rich source of that stuff. And those guys are the people, I think, that Larry Summers is kind of subtly or not so subtly dismissing, as when he talks about the hyper-libertarian atmosphere around Bitcoin, which is what is traditional. It's come out of a bunch of hackers, anarcho-capitalists, cypherpunks. I mean, all of these people are integrated on these kind of things, like deep suspicion of government, absolute attachment to a sense of unconditional anonymity, and those are the kind of traits we're talking about. And on the other side, and more recent, but obviously much better funded, for one thing, are the mainstreamer guys. And by far, to my mind, the most interesting of these characters is Mark Andreessen. Again, I lose track of what I've sort of put on various kind of reading lists and stuff, but if I haven't, he did an absolutely superb interview about Bitcoin. I think it was for the Washington Post. I'll definitely link to it. Which was Bitcoin boosting hugely, but from a completely different orientation to the one that these ultras are like. It's Bitcoin boosting in a way that's extremely close to the Larry Summers position. And he actually says eventually those libertarians are going to realize that the public ledger is the greatest gift to conventional forms of regulation and oversight that could ever be imagined for financial innovation. This thing is totally harmless. Anything that you've heard from those crazy anarchists about this is going to collapse the financial system is ridiculous, and we have to create a world in which it's safe to invest large amounts of money in this coming revolution, but in the softest, most gentle, friendly form of revolution that is going to come from rolling out this Bitcoin infrastructure. So these people, Mark Andreessen even more than Larry Summers, totally convinced that the blockchain is not going to go away. It's an innovation of primary importance, but it can be mainstreamed. And I think that, you can see what Larry Summers was saying completely within that context. That he's saying the establishment, whether the financial establishment, the government, can live with this. And they can live with it because all the dangerous, scary stories we've heard about it aren't really true. The establishment is quite competent to manage it. And we simply can't let this innovation not occur just because the people on the front end of it were who they were. And now, I mean, I can't pretend that I'm neutral between these two positions. It's simply the case the ultras are a lot more exciting guys, and they're much more conceptually adventurous than the mainstreamers. But both sides are interesting, and the mainstream position also is strongly supported by retrospective look at the history of the internet, because all kinds of stages of the internet have been attended by the same wave of extreme, again, quasi-anarchistic excitement, followed by mainstreaming. So you look at the guys who were first who were putting all this stuff together in the garage, and they too thought this was going to bring down the state, that it was going to kind of super empower individuals, all kinds, and we end up with Facebook. So it's hard on the basis of that record to dismiss this type of thinking, that's for sure.
And the interesting thing, like we were talking about it before you joined the class, Nick, or you were before we go live, is that the media theory and academic people are mostly follow the mainstreaming, and this is what's fascinating to me. That like the lag between media theory and theorization of all of this and mainstreaming is sort of like, it's sort of fascinating, and that's why I don't want to self-congratulate us for being in this seminar, but that's why I think it's kind of crucial that like we're doing the Bitcoin and philosophy right now, almost just a little bit prior to its mainstreaming. So,
Right.
because normally the academia enters the picture, or humanity, particular type of academia, because Nakamoto is academic, but I'm talking about humanities, right? They kind of enter the picture after the serious side of it, right? Because a lot of academic people were thinking and talking about hyperlink and internet, but none of them were like half as interesting as CCRU or what you guys were doing, which is completely underground and it didn't last long. But yeah, so the mainstream academia is usually like a step like there's a lag with them and the mainstreaming.
Yeah. I mean, this ties up with this whole thing Ian was saying about Zizek, doesn't it, too? I mean, it's kind of interesting that he would so blithely confess to, if not a lack of, well, I mean, implicitly to a massive lack of interest, actually, isn't it? So I'm not even really seeing what the narrative behind that is. Is it that he's saying implicitly, this isn't serious? Or is he saying something else? I mean, he's supposed to be a kind of theorist of capitalism.
Right, I know. I just wanted to clarify one thing, not to cut you off, so continue as soon as I finish. No. I just wanted to say that my impression was that he just didn't know very much about it. Not that he didn't know very much about it because he didn't think it's very serious, though one simply doesn't know.
Yeah.
That may be the case, but he didn't say that he doesn't take it seriously.
Right. Yeah.
So I just wanted to,
But there's obviously a weird non-linearity there, isn't there?
Yeah.
I mean, if he simply doesn't know? I mean, it's not so obscure.
Right. That's what. Yeah.
So it at least suggests to me that there's a kind of orientation of awareness that has to have some strategy behind it, such that it could pass under the radar. And I mean, like Mo says, I'm just using him as an example. I mean, because normally he's someone who you would think would want to be on the edge of these kind of topics because it seems so close to sort of things that should concern him. But I mean, it's interesting to me that even this topic, Bitcoin and philosophy, you would think is pretty white bread kind of thing. I mean, and yet it doesn't really seem. It really doesn't seem to be much to pull up at this stage on this topic. I don't know why that is.
Yeah, it's I wonder if it's kind of a, I hate to say this, but it's not being hip to to how fast technology is moving to some extent. I think it's just so important to be on top of it. But it's in the context of his talk that I asked this question. The context was about high frequency trading and this idea that there are fiber optic cables being built. There was apparently already one between Chicago and New York, but now overseas, so that, for example, if somebody was to buy a stock, in the time it takes after they click the button for that data to be sent to the place which is going to then sell it, let's say it takes 7 milliseconds for it to literally travel the cable and be processed. That or sorry, over Wi-Fi or however satellites, that fiber optic cable will allow people to beat that sale, get in the middle of it within a 7-second period to then.
Well, seems like he's been reading the latest issue of Collapse and Nick and Alex's essay on cunning automata, right?
Well, this whole high frequency trading thing is obviously fascinating to people, isn't it? As one particular way that these very easily indexed axis of technological development impinges on the economy in a really strong way. Like, I don't know whether you saw this story about, there are now these laser receptors that have been put up within around the block of these key financial institutions in New York, so that at the speed of light, you don't have to be more than 1 block away from the source of information. You know, because if that light beam had to travel a kilometer, you would be out of the loop in terms of the response time that is now expected in these trades. I mean, it's just hitting these absolute cosmic limits now, where you know, light, the speed of light is being perceived as a fundamental barrier to the speed of executing certain trades.
May I ask?
What Zizek should have really like, I may have to move to my power. What he should have really thought about was the fact that a lot of this speed is accommodated for intelligent machine trading and not human trading. Like,
yeah, of course.
Like these speeds are not for humans because they're not for the click of the humans. Actually, it is mostly for machines to be able to like run those algorithms and make them right?
Yeah, he did take that into account. I mean, he basically said it's all automated. I mean, it's not like humans making these decisions. Of course, we're talking about less than 7 milliseconds. So, yeah.
May I?
Can it?
Oh. I'm trying to ask the question, but you still continue talking, and so are you all finished?
Yes, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Am I right when I characterize our society that it becomes more shigotic? It becomes more and more shapeless, and it finds more and more ways to avoid from any form, any regulation that we want.
So, what? I'm not sure. I'm hanging on to what the subject of this is.
Am I right in characteristic of our society that it avoids any control, any forms, any shapes? It becomes more shigotic. It becomes it always can find a new way to avoid our control, to avoid our plans and our ideas how our society should be structured.
Well, I don't know. It's interesting, but also complicated that the two subjects of a sentence is our society, isn't it? Like you're saying, isn't it true about our society that it is this evasive, complicated blob, and it's escaping our control? So, I mean, I'm not really seeing what the contestants, they seem to me to be folding into each other in a slightly intriguing fashion. Aren't we society, or, I mean, what is this society that is escaping us? I'm not quite getting it.
I more and more think that it's this word is almost senseless. It doesn't has any real meaning. And I remember your article on the outside in. It's I may be pronounced wrong. Trichotomocracy, right?
Sorry, I'm sorry to get you to repeat what is obviously a hideous piece of
Your
jargon.
article, I remember your article, trichotomocracy.
Right.
And you described the system how we should structure the society. How is it correlates to what are you saying today?
You know, well,
maybe it's
yeah, I think that it's slightly complicated, because obviously there's a lot of context that I think is involved in this, that is not going to be straightforward to people without some background to it. It was part of a sort of tangled internal debate, and I think if I'm remembering the right article, it's a while since I've looked at this post. It was formulated as a kind of science fiction, projection, wasn't it? In order to shake up certain positions that were already sort of established, like yeah. I think, you know, that I would have to sort of reread this thing and then reflect upon what we've talked about today and make the connection, because it's not a connection that is ready to hand for me at the moment. I can't. I'd have to sort of think about it.
Maybe on the classroom. Maybe on the classroom page.
Yeah, for sure.
Everybody here has access to the classroom page, right? If you don't, just email me or ask me, and I'll send you the code that you can link in the code to have access to it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought,
try, sort of, without wanting to bully people, try to put one sentence on in the week. You know what I mean? It can be short, it can be incoherent, the grammar can be terrible, lots of spelling mistakes, all fine. But just, even if just to say, could we perhaps talk about this next week? Or, you know, this seems to me something that we could push into a bit further. You know, I mean, of course people are very welcome to say more than that, but I think it would be just helpful, just in terms of people for themselves getting some sense about the tack that they want to be taking into the topic. And sorry, can I, while I'm babbling, can I just say, I've got a kind of 4-week topic organization going ahead. There's flexibility for that, but I will use that as a kind of constraint for myself on what I'm going to treat the next 4 weeks as being about. So if people want to do big structural moving around exercises on that topic list, then they should get started and levering away, because it's like set in stone to a certain extent for me. It's not that I know exactly what is going to be said, but it's just that that grid is something I'll be relying on personally.
cool.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks for the heads up.
Okay.
So, are there more questions? Because we're past a couple of minutes past the time. Are there more questions, or people want to continue the discussion, or should we end it here?
Nothing in the scope of the next few minutes.
I just wanted to say one last thing, just following up.
We can go over time as long as Nick doesn't mind, right? Last week we went like 40 minutes over time because the conversation was interesting.
Yeah.
I'm still cool, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to go back for 1 second to that video, because I felt
Right.
when it got into the mainstreamers versus the ultra, and that was really interesting. I wanted to say one thing specifically, that one thing I found peculiar about the video was his analogies, and maybe this just ties into why he's a mainstreamer, but in particular there were two. One was with regards to the FFA and mainstream airline, like the network of airlines in America. I believe he was talking about America. And he said that you know, without the FFA, we wouldn't have this transportation system. and the proliferation of it in the way that we do. So that was one metaphor. The other one was he talked about some kind of common law, commonwealth, corporation.
Yeah, totally.
And then he says, and I might be mixing up the analogies, but basically the idea was these companies that initially didn't want to be taxed, like internet companies, now desperately want to be taxed because it means that what they're doing is legal.
Right.
So he's kind of saying, like, we need the FFA for Bitcoin.
Right.
We need the thing that can be taxed, like the centralized, and it seems so antithetical to, like, the philosophical principles of Bitcoin.
Right. Yeah. No, there were two stages to that. I mean, it was really fascinating, the whole thing. I totally agree with you. The first stage was where he said the biggest step forward for the common law corporation was the ability to be sued.
Oh, right.
And then he, with the same kind of logic, actually, and that's a very interesting. I mean, to be honest, both are interesting, but I think that point to me is especially crucially interesting because it is tied up with a very deep issue at the core of Bitcoin, which is to do with self-binding. It seems like contradictory on one level that you could be empowered by self-restriction. It's this famous Nietzsche thing about an animal with the right to make promises. But actually, it keeps cropping up over and over again, this issue. Like, obviously, on one level, Bitcoin, you cannot cheat. Therefore, you cannot double spend. It's an actual constriction of your capacities that allows it to then, therefore, that a Bitcoin transaction has the value it does, precisely because it is pre-constricted by this system. And the game theory one, which I think this blogger Scott Alexander, who's really smart, interesting guy, makes very clearly, where he says, look, in game theory, this self-constriction thing happens all the time. I don't know whether this is the example the example that he gives is the Dr. Strangelove one about the machine that automates nuclear retaliation. So you cannot, if you are subject to nuclear strike, you cannot choose not to respond, and therefore you're constricting and inhibiting your power. But in strict game theoretical terms, it's a very powerful move because people know if they subject you to a nuclear attack, they will be retaliated against. And there is no possibility of that not happening. Or the one that I think is even more fun is this thing about the game of chicken, the two cars racing towards each other. And, the winning move in chicken is not only to be seen knocking back a bottle of vodka before you get in the car, but then very conspicuously, as you're approaching maximum speed, to hurl the steering wheel out of the window so that the other vehicle driver knows you cannot dodge even if you want to. You have eliminated your possibility of swerving, and therefore they are then put in the dilemma that they swerve or die. The option that if they don't swerve you might is now no longer part of the scenario. So they crop up all the time, these, and I respected him for that point. Even whatever my disagreements, I thought he was understanding something important about it. But I think, again, you'll find that Andreessen and these people would be very in tune with this. That if you seriously want to make money out of Bitcoin, they would say, then you don't try and avoid the tax man. You don't try and these pirates aren't where the big bucks are. The big bucks is in building up this massive, worldwide web, whatever we're onto now, 5.0 or something, on the basis of the blockchain. Massive capital investment in all of that, and just play the game nicely and pay your taxes and obey the regulation and try and keep out irritating little players and all of that stuff. And that's how you are going to get rich. And I'm sure that is a growing position.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, all the ultras are absolutely
That's actually
appalled.
the main part of the mainstreaming, right?
Yeah, that is the mainstreaming process, 100%. You know, that this is something that we can digest into our recognizable social structures.
Mm-hmm. Right. Gotcha. Thanks.
More question or comments, or should we end the session? Laura, I heard you were going to say something earlier on, but then Igor took over, and then you didn't really finish it. You still want to say it?
Yeah, but it's okay. Otherwise, I'm just gonna post it on the classroom. I'll bring it up next. It just had to do with the double spending thing. I don't know. Can we just go on for another 10 minutes?
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah?
I already put
Okay.
you on the main screen, so go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, well, I had a question about, which I guess it ties with all these issues. Like, so basically, we started Bitcoin, right? It tries to tackle the problem of the double spending, the doubling of spending and of identity, right? But I was thinking in relation to finance, what about the doubling of risk? I'm thinking about synthetic finance, credit derivatives, CDOs, and so all these financial instruments that basically they don't have any underlying asset, right? So I was, and obviously people like, I don't know, for instance, Andres and other, I guess, mainstreamers, I don't know, but like they try to push also the financial side of Bitcoin. So I was thinking, I don't know, what about the problem of the doubling of risk, perhaps? Is it, I don't know.
So with the doubling of risk, you mean how can Bitcoin accommodate these credit operations?
Well, how can he eventually, not really accommodating, like Bitcoin is sort of solved the problem of double spending and this doubling of identity, which is online. So maybe, I don't know, is it doing anything, or is there anything in the protocol, or is there anything that Bitcoin could do, or could have any potential in terms of solving the problem of the doubling of risk that is characteristic of contemporary finance?
Oh yeah, I mean Bitcoin in its basic form would eliminate it entirely.
Right.
I mean, there's all criticism that could be made at that from conventional macroeconomic perspective. You know, it's deflationary. It's complete. There is no financial discretion. All of these arguments could be made, but it simply does not facilitate credit operations at all. You know, if we do a transaction, I have to transfer a certain number of Bitcoins from my account into your account. I can't. A promise to pay you Bitcoins at some future time has no meaning within Bitcoin at all. I cannot do fractional reserve spending. I cannot take some Bitcoins from you and lend out 8 times that number of Bitcoins to other people like banks do with fiat currencies. All of these basic financial operations simply cannot occur in Bitcoin.
I don't know, because for instance, I know that there are some exchanges in which you can trade derivatives of Bitcoin, of the value of Bitcoin, according to, I don't know, other exchanges, whatever.
But they are off-protocol exchanges. I mean, we could do a deal now, couldn't we? I mean, I could say to you, look, if Bitcoin is worth $500 in 2 months' time, you give me X amount of money, or I give you X amount of money, or we could have a bet on the value of Bitcoin privately now. Nothing stopping us. And so that's about Bitcoin, but it's only about Bitcoin in the same way that if we were betting on a football match, or we were betting on a political election, or any of these things, you know, it's a completely extraneous side bet that we are making on it. So of course the people involved probably have an interest in making it look as if it's actually more integrated than that. It's, you know, there's very similar things in the gold market. You know, you can engage in all kinds of weird derivative trading about gold price and whatever that is completely paper based and virtual, and has nothing to do with a piece of gold in your basement. And the people doing that want that aura of a piece of gold in your basement to spread onto their stuff, you know, and make you think that you're in the gold market, and the security and solidity and all of that stuff of gold somehow rubs off on these financial operations. But they are separate things.
So, I mean, the essence of that maybe is that these exchanges where you can trade complex derivatives ultimately require escrow and enforcement, right? Because the only way to really make it stick is if somebody takes hold. I mean, either people get tracked down for welshing on their bets, or they put money down up front to cover their bets that with a bookie who provides escrow services and then gives it back at the end. Is an alternative to that maybe to take one of these blockchain identity schemes? And, I mean, this seems like, as far as I can imagine, it seems like only loose enforcement. But if you link a derivative trader identity established on an altcoin blockchain to the blockchain recording the transactions for the currency you're actually writing derivatives on, like, I don't know, the image in my head is kind of a double helix, but where your identity is forsworn or penalized if you welsh on bets that you've made in the writing of a derivative on your original currency. Like, does that provide an alternative solution that wouldn't, you know, involve sort of transcendent enforcement?
Yeah. I mean, I say yup in the sense that I'm 100% convinced that people are working on that stuff. I mean, it depends where you are on the spectrum. Like the Andreessen types, because they expect there to be a smooth continuum, really, between at the end, one end, like hard Bitcoin transactions, and on the other, this whole new Bitcoin economy with all kinds of financial instruments associated with it and running off side chains, like you say, they'd have no problem with that at all. And they would say, look, some smart startup in Silicon Valley is going to work out maybe a coin that will support some kind of derivatives activity on the edge of the blockchain, and they think that that was completely straightforward. Obviously, as you move down towards the ultra end, then you get people asking more pointedly, well, can you really do this without a third party? And if you need a third party, you're obviously just, as far as they're concerned, off the blockchain. I mean, it's not even interesting from their point of view. It's just confusing people if you actually have a sort of secondary or para-financial system that's kind of just marginal to Bitcoin and supporting a whole sense of Bitcoin-related activities, but with third-party based, trust-based, traditional financial structures there. So I don't know. If the question more specifically is, could this particular thing be fully automated without a transcendent, without a third party on some kind of blockchain, then I'd have to spend hours thinking about that. I mean, it's like complicated.
Yeah, I guess that was pretty much it. And yeah, obviously, I need to have a good think about that as well. I guess it was just more, if there was a question there, it was just, you know, can we rigorously separate that to the extent that it could exist, you know, at least in principle, from transcendent escrow and enforcement, or could we generalize escrow and enforcement as an alternative category to, you know, complementary identity chains?
I think that there's one position that maybe is like diagonal to this, where people say anything that involves trust potentially could be moved onto the blockchain with a sufficiently clever solution. And that the blockchain has just shown us that trust can be substituted for this automated protocol, and with, you know, that ultimately then the problem is almost like just topological, that we just have to work out how our particular trust problem we've got now can be twisted and shaped so it can just slot into a blockchain oriented solution, and then we've solved it, you know. And I think that it's not clear if we're on this kind of mainstream versus ultra line, it's not clear where that would belong. I think either could perhaps live with that.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be pretty extraordinary because seems like that would kind of amount to a practical purpose for this transcendental inquiry, would be working out like a general formalism or something or other for converting these trust problems into blockchain solutions, which would be, well, extraordinary is about the best I can do.
Yes, I mean, it tends to be in all these kind of outer edge capitalistic sort of innovations that you have these kind of Gödel type problems, don't you, where there's no final formalism, but there's always the potential for a superior formalism that's going to address those particular inconsistencies that your last formalism missed out on,
right.
and largely through game theoretic things, because people are always trying to arbitrage and exploit precisely those untangled edges of the system. So they're always going to be, people will find those inconsistencies, exploit them, and therefore provide a kind of an economic incentive for someone to then address that. So I would expect that sort of dynamic more than a kind of final formalism that's just going to deal with that for all time. But I think the principle of a rolling, open-ended potential for formalization for sure is imaginable, yeah.
Okay.
I could just, because I'm keeping everyone up now, but just to say to Igor that it's kind of a bit coming back, what he was asking about, and I'm sorry that I was so incompetent at answering that question. And it was definitely to do with systems of distributed control. So I do think in that way it's relevant, but I think it would be better for me to address it. I'll go and reread the thing again and look at it and respond properly.
I don't know if this is a good time to ask this question. Oh, sorry, Nick.
Go ahead, Amy.
Yeah, go.
No, okay. Because it relates to last week's course that I missed, but I didn't want the question to get away too far into the last module. It was about this kind of shorthand narrative of modernity that you gave towards the middle, about the idea that the negation of teleology initiates a new kind of modality of engaging with technical or mechanical systems, which then ends up bringing back a new kind of telos in that moment. And I was wondering, because this is a question that I've been trying to think through a lot recently, if this is a way of, like in the long form understanding of what modernity does, of reconciling the problem of modernity's obsession with novelty and the idea of fate. And so this notion that there is a kind of return to fate through novelty, and the two are intrinsically linked in a way, like how we were talking before about the horror of the double, in a way. And that if the kind of technical question I had in relation to your piece in the Accelerate reader was that, is this second teleology is something that we then need to understand as what you call teleonomy? Is there a distinction between this sort of this secondary teleology and the idea of teleonomy, or does it come back as teleonomy because it's active in a different substrate?
I think, as you'd expect me to say, that I think it's complicated. I mean, the trouble is that the word teleology was at a certain stage super politicized, and all politicized language becomes unwieldy very quickly. I mean, we know with all our political vocabulary that the words are sleazy and confusing and move around and kind of switch meanings, and as soon as there is a kind of politicization of language, it becomes extremely difficult to get a grip on it in the way that you can with other terms. And because the case against teleology was so intrinsic to the kind of initial, which is also the most violent and fanatical and enthusiastic impetus of modernity, and therefore at the time was a kind of super politicized piece of vocabulary, the echoes of that, I think, are still with us. And so I think that you hear people talking about teleonomy precisely because teleology is like still too radioactive, which I think is both interesting. I mean, it's a triple thing. It's interesting. It tells us something as well that is actually, in the way you described, recursively tied up with actually this exact teleological process. But it's also hang on one second, the third part. Yeah, sorry, I've got a kind of thread of thought collapse at that moment. I mean, it's something that I think requires suspicion, and I think a lot of people use teleonomy because they simply don't want to touch teleology, but there's no reason for it that could be articulated in a way that isn't ultimately this political negotiation with the word. It's like, obviously biology in particular, it's like all the time tries to talk about teleology, but will never use that word. It would be an utter death sentence for them to do it. And they've managed to get teleonomy on, and the trend will be for teleonomy to become the most perfect substitute, an absolute clone in terms of its semantic content of an intelligent sense of teleology, because that's what the word is for. But that final step of saying, well, come on, damn it, this big fight was 500 years ago now, can we just have this word back? Isn't gonna happen, in my opinion. It's just too baked in the cake.
Is that what's behind the necessity to then to coin a new term, and to come up with the name teleoplexy? Is that what was behind that kind of part of the?
Actually, to be honest, I would have to go back to it again because I don't think if that was, it's a particularly justifiable. It's so purely tactical that it would surprise me that I could be quite so depraved quite so recently. But I mean, it is possible, and I would have to have a look at it to say.
Alright, cool. Thanks.
But I mean, on your basic point, though, all I can do is just totally endorse the suggestion. I think it has to be exactly that nexus of innovation and fate, but innovation dramatized to the point of total historical break, and at the same time, precisely as a fatality. The introduction of a fatality. So I think I totally agree with what you're saying
there. Thank you so much, Nick.
Okay, everyone. Sorry to keep everyone in this.
No. I'm just saying thank you, particularly not saying like it's the end, but just to say thank you for the response, and see if other for final comments you have something to say, or if anybody still has something they want to talk about. This is the last call. If this was a bar.
Yeah, it's looking to me a little bit like sort of embarrassing recollections of the scenes of rock festivals when I was 17 years old, and people have not slept for three nights. But I mean, maybe I'm just projecting that onto everyone.
No, just projecting. Though we all are. It's amazing. The time zone differences here are incredible. I mean, I was up at 6:30, and it must be 4 a.m. coming on.
I was up. I usually get up at like 5:15, and I start setting up the procedure. So I've been up in Vancouver 5:15 a.m.
But
so,
I like that Amy's question kind of took us back.
Oh, Ian's frozen now, is that right?
Yes. You got to finish on a loop, right?
Yeah, took us back.
Okay, I guess Ian is gone. Oh, there he is.
Oh no, he's
No,
back.
I'm here. I don't know what happened.
Yes.
We didn't hear a word of what you were trying to say.
Oh shoot! Oh, I just said.
Well, we heard the last thing we heard was you said took us back.
Oh, took us back to the first or second class, where you mentioned those really interesting thoughts about teleology and the scholastics and Aristotle and kind of getting over a kind of teleology. I thought all that was really interesting, so I'm great that that's a part of the conversation still. Grateful that is, and grateful to Amy.
Yeah, good.
Sorry, I was pirating some sample libraries to make music later. My internet's slowing down now.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so is it finished? Can we wrap up today?
Sounds good.
Yeah, from my point of view, it would be fine. I don't know if is everyone else okay with that. Okay, thanks as always, Mo. And your 5:15 thing is now going to haunt my dreams. So
don't worry about it. I look forward to this, and I have a system of waking up that is really good. The way I do it is I make a cup of Americano coffee and I leave it next to my bed, and then when my alarm rings, I just get up, I drink it, and I push snooze, and then I go back to bed. But within 2 minutes, the coffee just wakes you up, and then you're like, okay, I'm done. So by the time your alarm rings second time, you're already up, and you're like kind of like totally like speed up and running. So that's the way I get up. So
cool. I'll have to learn from that. Yeah.
Anyways, thank you so much, everyone, for this wonderful session, and looking forward to the second 4 sessions starting next week.
Okay, cool, great.
Okay, everyone. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks. Have a good week, everybody.
Bye-bye.